Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me as always, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. Happy Tuesday to all of our listeners. It's time to turn the page, that ugly ending to Sunday's game between the Seahawks and Titans. We're moving on from that game, and it's time to start preparing for Week 3. The Seahawks heading back on the road to face the Minnesota Vikings. So for Throwback Tuesday, as we do each and every week, we're going to look back at the last couple times these two teams clashed at Lumen Field. And then in the third quarter, we'll be checking out what's new with the 2021 Minnesota Vikings. The Locked On NFL Draft podcast relaunches September 20th with brand new hosts. Eric Crocker brings player scouting. Ryan Tracy brings the analytics. Follow the Locked On NFL Draft podcast on YouTube, the Odyssey app, or wherever you get podcasts. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks. Back in August, the Seahawks gave Jamal Adams a 4-year, $70 million extension, making him easily the highest paid safety in NFL history. It was a move that was met with some skepticism in some corners, but most people felt like it was the right move to make, especially after the Seahawks traded a couple of first-round picks to acquire Adams from the Jets before the 2020 season. They were fired up to get him back on the field. Going into year 2, the expectation was that he was going to be much more comfortable in this defense, and consequently, his play was going to be elevated, even from being a second-team All-Pro last year. But I found some of the comments that Pete Carroll made during his Monday press conference to be a little bit enlightening in terms of where Adams is at right now. He said that both the Seahawks and Adams are still both learning. And in particular, he said that Adams is still learning how the Seahawks are going to use him. And Carroll also mentioned that his aggressiveness is something that he's going to have to figure out in terms of playing assignment sound football, executing those assignments. We're now 15 games into Adams' career in Seattle. He has been here long enough. I think it's fair to scrutinize those comments. If that is still where the Seahawks as a coaching staff and Adams as a player are at right now, I think it's fair to criticize, because this is a guy you just paid $70 million, more than $17 million per year. You're paying him to be a superstar, and while he's been decent the first 2 games, it doesn't look like he is playing at that level that you invested for him to be.
No, I have to agree with you. I think for that price, you are looking for a difference maker, and I have yet to see Jamal Adams make a difference in either of the first 2 Seahawks games. Now, and what's frightening, and I think that it's all the more reason why we need to be having this conversation now, is, of course, you're going to be rolling into a Minnesota Vikings squad that is about as talented as any in all of the NFL. I mean, you think about the running back talent they have, the receivers. This team is absolutely loaded. And so if Jamal Adams is going to make some big plays and justify the huge contract and all of the faith that the Seahawks have placed in him with that big trade, as you mentioned, as well as the contract, then the time is now. And so it is a little disconcerting to be hearing this kind of news that Pete Carroll, Jamal Adams, both are kind of talking about that they're still kind of feeling each other out. They're just kind of learning where he fits in best. And I think that we all realize that Jamal Adams is a spectacular talent, but at the same time, sometimes his willingness to over pursue and try to make that big play puts the rest of Seattle's defense in a very difficult position. We saw that with the big touchdown run from Derrick Henry. Jamal Adams coming up as aggressively as he did, that is his lane, but when he got too far upfield, then he basically gave Henry a lot more space and with to work. And that put he against Trey Flowers essentially in a one-on-one situation. And Derrick Henry was able to run away for it, obviously, for the big score. So to me, that's just one play that is what basically people have been criticizing Adams for, going back to his time at LSU, that sometimes it looks like he is looking for the splashy play rather than playing consistent defense. And with Pete Carroll, Corbin, that he's looking for consistency, reliability on the defensive side of the ball rather than the splashy plays.
And it's one of those situations, it's really difficult as a coach, because we see this with Russell Wilson at quarterback. There are times where doing the unconventional ends up paying big dividends for the Seahawks when Russell Wilson is able to create with his legs, improvise plays. And then you see plays like the end of overtime where he tried to spin away from a couple sacks and should have probably been called for a game-ending safety there in the end zone. They ended up ruling him down at the 1-yard line. But you take the good to the bad, and I think it's kind of similar when you're talking about Jamal Adams, because we know that he can make spectacular plays when it almost looks like he's freelancing, deciding when he's going to blitz and when he's not going to. We know that he's capable of turning in those splashy plays. But as you mentioned, the flip side is if it doesn't pan out, if you are too aggressive getting upfield and you create those run lanes, then you're hurting the rest of your team. And so discipline is something that I think is going to be really key. And Pete Carroll's been talking about that, whether it's been penalties or not having their gap assignments correct. They just struggled to play with discipline in the second half. And Jamal Adams is the name that he threw out there on that touchdown play, just being a bit too aggressive. He's got to figure out how to find the fine line between playing with his hair on fire, which really is a great asset for him most of the time, and being more assignment sound, being able to execute those assignments. And through the first 2 games, Rob, he doesn't have a single pressure or a single quarterback hit. The one pressure that he has had ended up being nullified the other day by a roughing the passer penalty, which I think was the right call. He hit him high and it was helmet to helmet. They are going to call that every single time in today's NFL. He's got to hit lower on that particular play. But my point is, you're getting some tackles in volume, but what else are you getting? He hasn't gotten his hands on a pass breakup, no interceptions. And I've got the data in front of me right now. I mean, the Seahawks are giving him more opportunities where he's playing deep. He's been playing as a free safety, according to Pro Football Focus, on almost 40% of Seattle's defensive snaps. Last year, he only played that role 19% of the snaps that he was on the field. And he played 10% more in the box or on the defensive line than he has through 2 games. And that might be something that changes week to week depending on the opponent. Maybe the Vikings, they'll have him playing towards the line of scrimmage a lot more. But he's been playing a lot of those 2 deep safety looks, and yet, you look at the coverage stats, he's given up 4 receptions for a little over 20 yards, no touchdowns. He hasn't been bad, but when you pay a guy the money that they paid him, they are paying him, you are expecting superstar plays. And so it feels like the Seahawks, when you look at that data where they're moving him around position-wise, it still feels like Pete Carroll mentioned yesterday that they are trying to figure out what is the best way for us to use this unique talent. And on the flip side, Jamal Adams is still trying to find his way in the scheme. And I think that, like I said, it's totally warranted that people are going to scrutinize that fact that you've now played 15 games and both sides are still in this position. I think the coaching staff, from this point on, there's still plenty of time. It's early, and we know how great of a player Jamal Adams is. They can get this ship righted, but the coaching staff has got to do a better job putting him in a position to be successful. And when they do that, Jamal Adams has got to make superstar plays. That's what you're paying him for. He has to make the type of impactful plays that we've seen from Bobby Wagner and some of the other really good players on defense. He hasn't had any of those flashy plays so far. Number 33 has just got to step up his game. The coaching staff can help him by really maximizing his strengths. And I think blitzing him a bit more is going to be part of that. He's only blitzed on 8% of their defensive plays so far. He was around 14% last year. Some people might be saying, well, why blitz when you don't need to? Well, the pass rush wasn't great on Sunday. You still got to maximize what his biggest strength is, and he is a rare talent in that regard.
He absolutely is, and I would agree with you. I think that Seattle does need to take advantage of what makes Jamal Adams a special player, and his burst off the line, is fantastic. Obviously, as a smaller player than most of the other people on the line of scrimmage, it should be quick. But his anticipation, his speed, his ability to change directions, his physicality for a player of his size to be able to compete at the line of scrimmage just kind of speaks to his toughness, his intensity, all the things that make him a special player. It's almost like Seattle was asking him to play a little bit more in coverage, like to kind of show everybody else out there might be watching, like, see, he can play that full safety role. And I believe that he can do that. He's done that in the past. He did that at LSU. That's why he was the high draft pick that he was. But at the same time, what makes him special is closer to the line of scrimmage. I would say this. I think the strong running games, the very focused, pretty much one-dimensional, frankly, running games that Seattle has faced the last 2 weeks against the Colts, against the Titans, I think did play a role in how Seattle used them. And certainly the improved nickel cornerback play of Blair and Amadi, I think, allows Seattle to move Adams around a little bit more. But as you just mentioned, Corbin, Seattle's inability to come up with timely sacks against the Titans while Tennessee was able to basically throw the ball all they wanted. Ryan Tannehill, 40 passing attempts and only getting 3 sacks, none of them by Adams, not the consistent pressure off the edge that we had seen before. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Seattle decides to go back to what made Jamal Adams special, go back to what allowed him to break the record, the most sacks ever from a defensive back, and basically unleash him against, again, the most explosive offense they've seen so far this season.
When we come back in the second quarter, we're going to shift gears to the Seahawks' upcoming game against the Minnesota Vikings. We're going to be looking back at the last 2 times these two teams met at Lumen Field in 2019 and 2020 for Throwback Tuesday. Don't go away. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're back and better than ever, and all eyes are on the gridiron as teams are back on to start another football season. And as always, BetOnline is your top spot for all the pro and college football action this season. They've got a new updated site and interface, even more odds, props, and contests. BetOnline.ag continues to be the number one source for everything football. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today to receive your 100% welcome bonus. That's double your initial deposit just for signing up. Don't forget to use the promo code NFL100. Whether it's football, basketball, boxing, or your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline, the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang. It feels like the Seahawks and Vikings, even though they are not in the same division, it feels like they play pretty much year in and year out. And really, for the last decade, the majority of those games have been played in the Pacific Northwest. The last 3 years, the Seahawks and Vikings met in the regular season in prime time at Lumen Field, then named CenturyLink Field. So these two teams have a lot of history against one another. They really have quite the rivalry, even though they both don't play in the same division. And finally this year, the Vikings have to be relieved about this. They don't have to get on a plane and fly out to Seattle. This will be the first time that the Seahawks have played a regular season game in the Vikings' new stadium. The last time these two teams met in Minnesota, I was there. I was outside that playoff game in January that was -8 actual temperature. I can remember my beard being completely frozen about 5 minutes after I got into the stand through the rest of the game. Could not feel my feet when I tried to walk out of the stadium that day. Luckily, the Seahawks were able to win thanks to Blair Walsh's shanked field goal at the very end. Obviously, we could sit here and talk about that Ice Bowl for hours because it was a very interesting game, a historical playoff contest just for the frigid temperatures. But that was the last time these two teams met. They met in the regular season in Minnesota as well that year. Seattle won that matchup 38-7 in a blowout. But the Seahawks have not been there aside from a preseason game dating back to 2016. So this will be the first time the Vikings get to play there. Let's look back at the last 2 times these teams met, though, in Seattle. The last 2 games have been barn burners. Back in 2019, the Seahawks managed to hold on for a 37-30 victory over the Minnesota Vikings. And this is one of those games. It's weird we're talking about it, Rob, because we just saw the Seahawks choke away a 14-point lead. They almost did that against the Minnesota Vikings that night back in 2019.
Yeah, they almost did. And that's what is kind of interesting about this game is there were a lot of parallels between that December 2nd, 2019 game at CenturyLink Field, or what would have been called CenturyLink Field there, obviously now Lumen, when Minnesota was obviously the opponent. And one of the things that immediately jumped out to me, Corbin, is I always look at rushing attempts. And we talked about yesterday with the Tennessee Titans and the fact that they continue to pound the rock with their stud running back in Derrick Henry. And obviously every Seahawks fan out there knows how that turned out with Derrick Henry running for 35 rushing attempts. You just don't see that in the NFL anymore. And Chris Carson running for, I believe it was 13 rushing attempts. And so really Seattle abandoned their run and Tennessee just doubled down on their run. And that's the parallel that I would throw out there with the Minnesota Vikings game a couple of years ago. Seattle had 43 rushing attempts and ran for 218 yards against the Vikings, which obviously is a pretty darn good day. But the Minnesota Vikings, with a guy as good as Dalvin Cook and some of the other backs that they had, they only rushed the ball 14 times in that entire game. And when you have the run differential that much more, then that almost always equates into a victory for the other team. And so that certainly was the case for the Seahawks with their 37-30 victory, even though, as you mentioned, Minnesota came roaring back and made this certainly a big, interesting game.
This was a true seesaw back and forth affair because Seattle was losing 17-10 going into halftime. Russell Wilson threw a pick six, a 20-yard return to Anthony Harris, and the Vikings had all the momentum going into the break. And then the Seahawks were able to go on an extended run. Rashad Penny scored a touchdown early in the fourth quarter that put the lead up to 34-17. The Seahawks scored 24 unanswered points. And at that point, it looked like the route was on, but the Vikings were going to make it interesting again. As the fourth quarter went on, they got two quick touchdowns. One of them was to Laquan Treadwell on a busted coverage. I remember Shaquille Griffin, everybody in the press box was like, what is he doing? Because Treadwell, it was pretty much like the Freddie Swain touchdown that we saw this weekend. There was nobody near Treadwell, just got behind the defense. Nobody seemed to notice him. 58-yarder, and then the Vikings got the ball back, and Kyle Rudolph got a short touchdown reception, and suddenly it's 34-30 with 7 minutes to go in the game. The Vikings had a chance to win it. Unlike this weekend, though, the Seahawks were able to finish the job, got a late field goal by Jason Myers, and they were able to hang on for the 7-point victory over their bitter NFC North rivals. Now, fast forwarding to last year's game, it was another one that was really strange because the Seahawks were down 13-0 at the half. They could not move the ball offensively. Russell Wilson looked horrific the first two quarters. The offense just was completely out of sync, but they had one of those vaunted runs. We saw it against the Titans where they scored 21 points pretty quickly in the second quarter the other day. They did the same thing early in the third quarter against the Vikings. First, Russell Wilson gets them on the board with a touchdown to Will Dissly. Then they get a forced fumble that's recovered by KJ Wright. I believe it was DeMontre Moore that hit Kirk Cousins on that play that forced the strip sack. Seahawks go down and get another touchdown, a pass from Wilson to Metcalf. And then literally 2 plays later, KJ Wright looking like Spider-Man out there, one-handed interception against Kirk Cousins. Next play, Chris Carson spins out of a tackle by all-pro safety Harrison Smith and goes the distance. Next thing you know, Seattle's down 13-0, and now they've got 21 points on the scoreboard, and they are winning the contest just like that. They scored 21 points in 1 minute and 52 seconds. Talk about a blink of an eye putting 3 touchdowns on the board. You just don't see that very often, and yet, just like the game they played the year before, the Seahawks had to really fight to be able to win this game because the Vikings didn't back down.
No, they didn't back down. And that's one of the things that's a little bit surprising about it is because the Vikings entered that game 1-3 and Seattle was 4-0 at that point. And so, at least I was expecting that Seattle was going to be able to just, beat Minnesota because they look like a shadow of themselves. This is before the rookie wide receiver, Justin Jefferson, absolutely exploded onto the scene and just became a different type of player for Minnesota. When they had an injury issue with Dalvin Cook, we talked about him before, he went down a little bit in this game and then wound up coming back and playing a little bit late in the game. You could just see how much that rattled Minnesota. And I thought that was one of the things that really sparked Seattle. And we talked about this before, again, with the Tennessee game, that sometimes Seattle's ability to have that quick strike offense can obviously put up points on the board, but it also doesn't give their defense much time to rest. So while Seattle was scoring a bunch of points, Minnesota was able to come back. They got another touchdown from Adam Thielen at the end of the third quarter. That tightened the game up. It was then 21-19 Seattle at the end of the third, and then Minnesota came right back with another touchdown from Kirk Cousins to Adam Thielen. So that put Minnesota up 26-21. But unlike last week, Seattle was able to to rescue that game late with Russell Wilson engineering a late drive and then throwing a perfect strike to DK Metcalf to win the game with only 15 seconds on the clock for one of the more spectacular barn burner type of games of the entire season. This is a game that I really thought suggested that this was a special year for Seattle. The way they came roaring back after starting off struggling so much as they did, they wound up winning 27-26 in a nail biter.
Yeah, it was one of those cases. I remember late, the Vikings actually went for it on fourth down, and then Cody Barton came up and stopped the running back short of the sticks. And so the decision not to kick the field goal came back to bite the Vikings. The Seahawks drive down, and Russell Wilson on fourth down finds DK Metcalf in traffic. Metcalf holds on in the end zone, and it's euphoria in everybody's bedrooms watching the game, because remember, there were no fans at the stadium last year. I was about to say the crowd went wild, but then I remembered, no, they did not, at least not in the stadium. There was euphoria at everybody's home entertainment systems watching this game, with the Seahawks pulling out the victory and improving to 5-0 to open the season. They're hoping to get back in the win column, going to Minnesota and continuing a win streak. They've won their last 5 games against the Minnesota Vikings. They have dominated this series. The Seahawks are hoping to continue that dominance on the road in week 3. When we come back in the third quarter, we're going to look at what's new with the 2021 Minnesota Vikings. It's been a pretty tough start for them in the win-loss column, but as you mentioned, a lot of talent on both sides of the football. We'll look at what's changed for them on their roster, their draft class, and some interesting statistics after the first 2 games. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. So why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing only the brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything you need, whether it's brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even a new steering wheel cover I got for my Dodge Charger. Go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto part needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the auto parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
Does this sound familiar? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows, you're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all that entertainment you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called Directv Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so that you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes and no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part, there's no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with Directv Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com.
Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang. The Seahawks turning the page from that abysmal meltdown on Sunday, losing to the Titans in overtime. And now they're going to get ready for their second road trip of the 2021 season, traveling to Minnesota to face the Vikings. As we talked about last quarter, Rob, this is the first time the Seahawks have played in Minnesota since that Ice Bowl back in January 2016. They also played the Vikings in a preseason game at US Bank Stadium. But this will be the first time these two teams have battled in that new stadium in a regular season contest. And the Vikings, they're coming off a disappointing season last year, did not make the playoffs. One of their losses, they started 1-4. That loss to the Seahawks at home, that really put them behind the 8 ball, and they were not able to recover. For a little bit, it looked like they might still threaten to make the playoffs, but fell apart a little bit at the end of the year. There were a few changes during the offseason as well, but Mike Zimmer's still the coach. They still got Kirk Cousins, a talented group of receivers, Dalvin Cook in the backfield, and some talented players on the defensive side of the football. Unfortunately for them, that has not led to victories to this point, as they've opened the year 0-2 and are now at the bottom of the NFC North.
Yeah, it has been a disappointing start to the season for the Vikings. As you mentioned, there's a lot of really explosive talent, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Minnesota has made some veteran additions. Patrick Peterson, of course, longtime Arizona Cardinal, now starting cornerback for the Minnesota Vikings. So that just being one of the players that has definitely boosted their defense, at least on paper. The return of one of the most dynamic edge rushers in all the NFL, Danielle Hunter, who has 4 sacks in just 2 games for those Minnesota Vikings, definitely has added to their defense. But at the same time, they're 0-2. Their first game of the year, they lost the Cincinnati Bengals. Last week, they got beaten by those same Arizona Cardinals. And so, again, it has been a slow start for Minnesota. But I think that this is kind of an appropriate point for the Seahawks here. We talked about what a historic game that playoff victory in Minnesota was a few years ago, given the frigid conditions. And, of course, unfortunately for Seattle fans, it was a historic loss. And collapse for the Seahawks. They had never lost after leading by that much during the Pete Carroll era at home. So what an opportunity to come back to the last place that you had a history-making performance, to come back and hopefully right the ship from a Seattle perspective. So looking at Minnesota, to me, some of the key additions, as we already mentioned, is Patrick Peterson, but it's the 2 defensive tackles in the inside that I think could be key. Because as we talked about before, Seattle has tried to run the ball down Minnesota's throat before. That was successful for Minnesota and Arizona as well, even with the dynamic passing attacks that both those 2 teams have. But if Seattle wants to get back to its roots, then I think that they're going to have to do a nice job of blocking the 2 free agent additions, Dalvin Tomlinson, Sheldon Richardson, former Seahawk, obviously, in that defensive tackle position. Those are going to be 2 of the matchups that we'll probably be breaking down a little bit later this week.
Yeah, those 2 coming back really bolsters that interior line, because a couple years ago they lost Linval Joseph. They've had a lot of turnover at that position. Former Seahawk Shamar Stephen was back with Minnesota for a year. Now he's in Denver. So they've had to really shake that position group up over the last couple of years. A lot of new faces. Normally the defensive line's been a strength for Mike Zimmer's squad. They're still trying to figure things out with that group. I think a couple names that we need to mention the secondary away from Patrick Peterson. Brashad Breeland formerly played for Washington as well as Kansas City. He brings a lot of experience to that secondary. And Xavier Woods, who they brought in from Dallas, has started quite a few games in the NFL as well. And he's had to step in with Anthony Harris going to the Philadelphia Eagles. And that, to me, would be the number one departure they had in this offseason. Kyle Rudolph's had a great career as well, but Anthony Harris played really well pretty much every time the Seahawks have played against the Vikings over the years. A really talented safety that the Vikings just could not afford to keep. So he's now in Philadelphia, and Xavier Woods has replaced his spot in the secondary. And this is a secondary that's had some trouble with passing games the first couple of weeks, even with those new faces that they have. They also made some big changes up front. They released Riley Reif, who's now with the Cincinnati Bengals, and they've had some changes up front. Their first-round pick, Christian Darrisaw, they were hoping was going to be a starter from day one, but he has yet to make his NFL debut, and it remains to be seen if he's going to be healthy enough to play this week for Minnesota.
Yeah, and I think that Seattle might be kind of hoping that the rookie does make his debut, just because obviously that inexperience can be something that pass rush that we've been talking about, really needs to, step up, frankly, for the Seahawks at this point. So I think that's going to be definitely something to watch. And for me, with the draft, background, I'm always fascinated to kind of talk about a team's draft and who was making immediate impact. And given the fact that the Minnesota Vikings entered last April's draft with the NFL, the highest number of draft picks of any club, I believe it was 13 at the time. They did lots of different trading and moving around, but I don't see a lot of players who are likely to make an immediate impact for the Minnesota Vikings. I see, the young tackle, Christian Darrisaw, who, as you mentioned, has not been able to play so far, due to injury. Kellen Mond, the backup quarterback to Kirk Cousins now, of course, he's not likely to see any type of playing time anytime soon, barring an injury to Kirk Cousins. Chaz Surratt, the linebacker from North Carolina, player that you and I liked a lot, but he isn't seeing much playing time. And I guess part of that is to be expected. When you have a head coach, old school kind of a guy, the way that Mike Zimmer is, he is typically been basically waited and waited and waited for his rookies to stand out before he really puts them in kind of a starring role. That's what made last year's, in my opinion, other than the quarterback Justin Herbert, the offensive rookie of the year by far, Justin Jefferson, the receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. That's what made it such a unique thing for him last year. I'm very curious when we start breaking down this game a little bit more in terms of matchups. That to me is one to watch, because it's been Adam Thielen who has kind of taken over that top spot as Minnesota's top receiver again this year, rather than Jefferson. And that's something the Seattle has to be concerned about, given the fact that they have had the inconsistencies that we've talked about all offseason at the cornerback position.
Yeah, the Vikings had all of those draft picks you mentioned, and yet only 4 players from that draft class have played in any of the first 2 games. And so part of that's Mike Zimmer's philosophy, as you mentioned, and I think part of it is they might have some draft picks that just don't pan out from that large group. It gives you a better chance to hit on players, but when you draft 13, 14 players, there are certainly going to be some guys that don't make it either. So there are some intriguing players in there that down the road could help them. I just would not anticipate that the rookie class is going to be doing much, if anything, for the Vikings in this upcoming game coming up on Sunday. Let's get into some of the numbers here. And again, very small sample size, but now that we've got 2 games under our belts, we're going to be throwing aside the 2020 stats for the most part and start really focusing on what we're seeing from teams in 2021. We'll start with the Vikings on offense. And I thought this was really interesting. Dalvin Cook is one of the best running backs in football, and maybe this is going to jinx the Seahawks, just me reading this stat. But so far, the Vikings have just 1 run of 20-plus yards in their first 2 games. They've been fairly effective running the ball. They're averaging 5 yards per carry, but they haven't had those explosive runs. And you and I both know, just based on the way last year played out, the Vikings were able to get a bunch of those in that loss to the Seahawks a year ago. And if Dalvin Cook didn't get banged up, Minnesota probably wins that game. So you know the running game is going to be a big focal point going into this rematch.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is going to be, especially coming off of Seattle's loss Derrick Henry and the way that they just ran the ball down Seattle's throat. I think the Minnesota's kind of chomping at the bit to be able to unleash Dalvin Cook on Seattle and see if Seattle's going to be able to hold up the point of attack against them. If you just jinx Seattle by saying that, I'll try and jinx Minnesota a little bit. Their passing game has been spectacular. I mean, 606 receiving yards so far in the first 2 games. Doesn't take a mathematician much to realize that means that Kirk Cousins is averaging over 300 passing yards so far over those first 2 games. He's got 5 touchdowns. He's got 0 interceptions. So again, looking at you pass rush, looking at you defensive backs, it's time to start making some big plays. Minnesota Vikings look like they are ready to hand you some.
Yeah, they have the 7th most yards by receivers, which isn't surprising when you consider that they have Jefferson, Adam Thielen. They got a number of other young guys they really like in that receiving core as well. They've got weapons for Kirk Cousins, and so that's going to be something to keep an eye on going against the Seattle secondary, especially the cornerback group that hasn't looked great in these first 2 games. A couple other stats on offense that I thought were interesting. The Vikings right now are tied for 3rd best. Seattle is tied with them, by the way. 80% red zone percentage, meaning 80% of the time they're getting inside the opposing 20. They are scoring touchdowns. So they have been one of the most efficient red zone offenses in the league. Even with only 1 rushing touchdown so far, they have been able to put the ball in the end zone. Kirk Cousins 5 times with touchdown passes. And their 3rd down conversion rate is on the other end of the spectrum. This might be the big reason the Vikings have struggled in these first 2 games, despite having all the yardage. They put up plenty of points, but they've only converted on 30.7% of their 3rd down conversions in the first 2 games. And right now, that ranks 31st in the NFL. So it's really hard for your offense to consistently put points to the board and keep yourself in games when you are struggling that much to keep the chains moving.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons, Corbin, why this is one of my favorite segments that we do every week, is I think sometimes when you kind of live in the Seahawk bubble and you just think, oh, woe is us with the offense is inconsistent. I mean, inconsistent offenses, that's almost, the nature of the beast. And the Minnesota Vikings, for all of their talent, for all of their splashy plays, for all of the consistency that they have among their coaching staff and the players, this isn't a new offense the way it is in Seattle. It's a lot of the same names. I mean, tight end position, they made the trade for Chris Herndon, so they don't have the rookie Irv Smith. They don't have, Kyle Rudolph from before, but that's about it. Maybe a little bit more transition along the offensive line, but certainly not like Seattle. And so the fact that they are 30.7% of the time, 31st in the league, as you mentioned, only a third of the time that they are converting the third downs, that's pretty ugly football from an offensive perspective. And so I think those are all kind of interesting things. On the defensive side of the ball, to me, is where Mike Zimmer has always kind of hung his hat. And that's what, to me, is kind of fascinating. And I do want to stress, though, that Minnesota, of course, played against, again, Cincinnati and Arizona. Those are two high-flying passing attacks when they're really working on rhythm. And Kyler Murray, is the NFL has seen over these last couple of weeks and last year as well, just an absolute dynamic talent. But still, this is a team that is giving up some big plays on defense. And I'm going to go back to the red zone. That's where obviously it all matters. 71.4% red zone percentage against. We just mentioned the fact that Seattle is very good in the red zone in scoring touchdowns. Well, Minnesota is equally bad at giving up points. So again, this is going to be one of those games where you fully expect the Seahawks to be able to turn their red zone opportunities into touchdowns, not Jason Meyer field goal attempts.
And I think the next stat that I'm going to roll with, obviously the red zone's been important. Seattle's really struggled in running the football. First game, Chris Carson looked pretty good against Indianapolis, but last weekend could not get the run game going against Tennessee. The Vikings have not given up any runs of 20-plus yards. They've been middle of the pack for yards per carry, but they have not given up explosives in the run game. And so I think that is something that's worth noting for the Seahawks as they try to get their offense rolling in more of a rhythm in week 3. And then you mentioned the red zone percentage. I think this is another stat that really jumps out to me from their defense. 10.5 yards per pass attempt against them in the first 2 weeks. So they have given up chunks of yards in the passing game. They are ranking second in that category. Only one other team has been worse. And so you're going against an offense in Seattle. For all the issues they had a week ago, they were still getting explosive plays. This is a secondary that's still primed to give up those downfield throws to DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and company.
It's a secondary that will give up some of those big plays if Seattle's pass protection holds up. As we talked about before, Danielle Hunter, his return has been a huge deal for the Vikings. 4 sacks in just 2 games, 11.2% of the time sack percentage. That's second best behind only the upstart Carolina Panthers as far as being the best pass rushing team in the NFL. Again, they were going up against Arizona and Cincinnati, and both those teams throw the ball an awful lot. So I think that Minnesota's pass rushers knew that they could just basically pin their ears back and go after the quarterback. And I think that's something that all the more reason why you want to run the ball a little bit. If Seattle can protect Russell Wilson, there should be holes in the secondary to exploit, but that's a big if.
Yeah, I'm glad you threw out the sack percentage because that's 11 out of every 100 dropbacks. They are getting sacks. That's a pretty high percentage. And again, it's 2 games. It's just been 2 games. It's a small sample size. But they also brought back Everson Griffin as part of their rotation. Mm-hmm. They got a couple other young guys they're rotating in. And Mike Zimmer knows how to coach up pass rushers. So that is going to be something to keep a very close eye on. Can the Seahawks offensive line protect Russell Wilson long enough to take advantage of that secondary? And we'll have a chance to really break down a lot of those matchups on our Wednesday episode. Really, we just kind of did a real nice job of listing off a few position groups to watch, but we'll really get in depth in tomorrow's episode. Betting on the NFL doesn't have to be a guessing game if you listen to the new Locked On Bets podcast hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, and Lee Sterling's Lock of the Day. Follow the Locked On Bets podcast brought to you by betonline.ag, wherever you get podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to check out Locked On Seahawks on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. That's AUDACY. When Rob and I return tomorrow, it's all about the matchups. When the Seahawks are on offense going against the Vikings defense, vice versa. We'll be breaking down 6 key matchups to watch unfold at US Bank Stadium. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.